Good afternoon. On behalf of the Holocaust and Genocide Studies program here at FIU, Hillel at FIU, and the Jewish Museum of Florida FIU, it's my pleasure to welcome you to FIU's 7th annual Holocaust and Genocide Awareness Week. My name is Brian Schreiner. I have the honor and privilege of serving as the Dean of FIU College of Communication, Architecture, and the Arts, and we are proud to sponsor this week's event and support the important dialogue taking place throughout the week. This afternoon, I want to welcome you to Unstoppable, the Siggi Wilzig story revisited. However, before I introduce today's speakers, I want to acknowledge our co-sponsors and those individuals in particular who make this week's events possible. I'd like to thank Dr. Oren B. Steer, Susan Gladstone Pasternak, Nancy Cohen, and John Warwick. I also want to thank all of you for joining us, for your contributions, and for your participation. As you know, today marks the International Holocaust Remembrance Day, commemorating the liberation of Auschwitz. And we are fortunate to be joined today by Ivan Wilzig, professionally known as Sir Ivan. He is an international recording artist and songwriter, best known for his pop dance remakes of 1960s and early 1970 peace songs. Sir Ivan founded the Peaceman Foundation, a nonprofit organization that battles hatred, violence, and PTSD. He is a co-owner of the Wilzig Erotic Art Museum in South Beach, Miami, Florida, and he serves, and I'm very happy that he serves on the College of Communication, Architecture, and the Arts Dean's Advisory Board. The story of his father's life is one of hope and resiliency in the midst of terrifying circumstances, an inspiring story for all, regardless of gender, race, religion, etc. I'm also proud to call him my friend. Dr. Oren Baruch Steer is director of FIU Holocaust and Genocide Studies program and a professor of religious studies in the FIU Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs. The author or co-editor of 3 books, his research addresses Holocaust testimony, Jewish memory, Holocaust education, and the material and visual culture of the Shoah and its remembrance. Dr. Steer teaches and lectures widely on the memory and representation of the Shoah, as well as on issues in religion and violence in contemporary Jewish studies, and co-organizes FIU's annual Holocaust and Genocide Awareness Week. Again, I'm proud to call Dr. Steer a friend and a colleague. And with that, let me hand things over to Dr. Steer and Mr. Wilzig.
Thank you, Dean Schreiner. I'm so happy to have you here and to have you introduce this program. It has been an incredible week. We have 11 events this week. This is our 9th. We have 2 more to go. I want to point out that today we're focusing in particular, because today is International Holocaust Remembrance Day, decreed by the UN in 2005 as a day in memory of the anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, as a day to raise awareness and educate the public about the Holocaust. And I think there's no better way to do that than to try to focus in particular on survivor narratives and survivor testimonies. Of course, many survivors are no longer with us, but they've passed their legacies on down to their children. And so our focus today is very much on that first generation and that second generation. And we're so pleased to have with us today Ivan Wilzig, son of the late Siggi Wilzig, to talk about his father's legacy. The impetus for this was the publication of the book Unstoppable, which is a biography of Siggi Wilzig, written by Joshua M. Green, with a foreword by none other than Deborah Lipstadt. Professor Deborah Lipstadt, recently nominated by President Biden to be the international watchdog for anti-Semitism. What we're going to do is we're going to first start with a rebroadcast of an edited video of an interview I did last May with Sir Ivan and with Joshua Green, the author of the book, as we discuss the book. And then we're going to come back and have a live conversation. So without much further ado, we are going to screen that video now, and make sure you stay with us until the video ends, and then Ivan and I are going to come back and have a conversation and also take your questions. At any point during the video, please feel free to post your questions in the chat, but just understand that the video itself is not live. You won't be able to ask Joshua Green any questions, for example. Okay, Nancy, please go ahead. I'd like to start out by asking Joshua, how did you come to writing this biography?
Kicking and screaming. I had written about a dozen biographies prior to this one, and I thought I was done. Really didn't want to dwell in the darkness any longer. My great privilege is having been trained at the Yale University Fortunoff Video Archive for Holocaust testimonies. And the scholars at Yale are very punctilious and exacting when it comes to allowing the words of the witnesses to guide the interview. The witnesses are the experts in their own experiences. And what that means is practically that for someone like myself, who's a documentary filmmaker, there's no opportunity to prejudice the editorial direction by highlighting moments of heroism or bravery. When you listen to testimony, you hear survivors talking about the unheroic things they had to do just to survive. So it's a dark subject to be producing or writing about. Then one day, about 8 years ago, the phone rings. And at the time, I didn't know that it was Ivan, Siggi's son. But someone says, I've read some of your books, and I think you're the right person to tell my father's story. And I said, I'm sorry, I'm done with the darkness. I just want to go toward light now. And Ivan, like his father, had a very energetic way of responding. He said, no, you don't understand. My father was the light. My father was a beacon of hope for every immigrant who ever came to America. And he continued on describing some of his father's remarkable achievements. And he convinced me to do some research. And we met, and I found that Ivan had not been exaggerating at all his father's accomplishments. And the more I learned about Siggi Wilzig, the more I thought, this is a story that deserves to be told.
Thank you. Wow, that's a great story. So, Ivan, I guess my first question for you is, I want to know how you convinced Joshua, but I think what I'd like to ask, and what I think the audience would like to hear is, I think those of us who know survivors, who know children of survivors, know that it's oftentimes a unique situation. What can you share with us, an anecdote or two about growing up as a child of a survivor, someone of with your father's experiences? What was that like?
Well, he was, because life became so precious to him, having seen so many people murdered on a daily basis, innocent men, women, and children, every hour on the hour for more than a 2-year period. Certain things must have traumatized him to the point where everything is a matter of life. It could be a matter of life and death. So he was a nervous, jumpy individual, and he would exaggerate something and look at it in the worst case scenario of what could happen if you do something incorrectly or foolishly or without thinking. For example, he would see 2 children fighting on a playground or something, and he'd say, "Stop!" He'd scream, "Stop it! Stop it! You're going to lose an eye." So where do you go from like children playing and wrestling to "you're going to lose an eye"? In other words, everything was intensified and exaggerated, but in reality, he had a certain, almost like a crystal ball ability, a mysterious power. And sure enough, 5 minutes after he had warned the mother, don't let the children horse around like that, one of the children would cut the other one's eye with a sharp object. So just like he could predict something like that, he was also later he was able to predict when the stock market would go up or down, or the economy would go up or down. He was always like he was just overly sensitized to life and things. He himself said he credited his fox-like instincts for having survived the camps, not his strength, not his brains, but sometimes knowing how to when to volunteer for something, when not to volunteer, when to raise your hand and or when to like stay in the background, when to make up this story or when to make up that story. He just had a sense he could for danger, and in that sense, that same sense of heightened senses, became an advantage later in business, because it was these were human senses that he always was sensitive to. So he could meet someone for 5 minutes. Somebody would come for a loan, dressed in a fancy suit and necktie, silk necktie and alligator shoes. And the guy would come with a financial statement and say, I own this building and this building, I own this one and this one, I own this business and that business. And 5 minutes after the guy walked out of the room, he would say, the man is full of it. These statements are worthless. He's a show-off. He wants to give the impression he's rich by the way he dresses, but he's completely leveraged. He's completely leveraged out. He has no equity in this. He's over-borrowed. He doesn't make enough money to pay back the loans. I wouldn't lend him a dime. It was like incredible how he had these sense, and it proved true. And by having that ability, he was able to make loan after loan in the hundreds, and keep the portfolio quality to make the bank very successful and grow rapidly.
Thank you. You know, it's amazing. The story is really remarkable about those instincts and such. I was, you know, when reading the biography, though, atypically, I would say, for a Holocaust memoir, and Joshua, you can tell me if I'm wrong, but the book says really very little about Siggi's life prior to deportation, aside from some anecdotes. We jump pretty quickly from 1936, when a 10-year-old Siggi moves with his family to Berlin to find better prospects. We jump from there to conscription of child labor, finding in 1943, a 16-year-old Siggi who had been making mine casings for the German war effort in a former lamp factory for 2 years or so. And all of a sudden he's arrested in the middle of the night shift, brought by a local policeman on the trolley to join his family as they're rounded up for deportation to Auschwitz. And so I was just wondering, and we're going to get to the other experiences too, but I was wondering if either or both of you could tell us something you learned from Siggi about his life before the war, something that kind of helps give a window onto his personality and his philosophies.
Well, I could say for one, and Joshua can chime in. For example, in his early years of childhood, he demonstrated how brave he was as an individual, which he was his entire life. Brave enough to sneak into Nazi embassies and try and steal affidavits that saved members of his families after they forged them and got them out, a few of them out in time. And so that's something that he showed from a very early age to the day he died. Brave, unbelievably brave.
Yeah, I'd add a couple of things to that. One is that, you know, parenting isn't everything, but Siggi benefited from very, very loving parents. I think if you have a mother and father who care for you and love you dearly, you've got a pretty strong leg up in life. And so he had that. So from a very young age, he was encouraged to kind of be all that he could be, you might say. At the same time, he also learned early in life to think like an adult. You know, when you're a kid growing up in Jew-hating Kroyanka, West Prussia, in the 1930s, early 1930s, uh, you don't mess around. There were two kids who caught him and dangled him over a meat grinder and threatened to grind him into Jew meat, the way they called it. And after that, he didn't play with kids anymore. He would hang out with the adults, study how they think, how they made decisions, watch them playing cards, learn strategies. So he, from a very early age, you know, he was thinking like an adult, and that helped him, I think, when it came to life or death decisions.
Yeah, that's really very telling. Thinking like an adult, I'm gonna come back to that issue, but you know, before I go on, I want to remind the audience that hopefully the chat is open and you could post any questions you might want to pose to Ivan and or Joshua in the chat, and we'll be getting to them, you know, about another 15 minutes or so. So feel free to post anytime. And one thing I really wanted to bring up, one of the activities I do with my students is exploring the issue of human relationships and ethics in the context of the Holocaust, particularly prior to and in the camps. So we read memoirs by Elie Wiesel and Primo Levi, and we discuss how the Shoah impacted concepts like trust and friendship. In your book, Joshua, Siggi credits his best friend Lothar Nartelski, Larry Nartel, who also survived, for saving his life in Auschwitz. And so I was wondering if each of you could give just maybe a little bit of perspective on Larry and Siggi's relationship, with him, and kind of, I was very struck by that. You know, the frame story, you know, speaking to Larry's parents, and I mean, there's really a lot there, and I think it's also important about afterwards how Siggi treated other people. So I'm just wondering what you might have to say about that whole issue of the importance of human relationships through the camps and what they mean to people, and how that's weighed against the problems of ethics and as Joshua, as you quote Lawrence Langer, choiceless choices in the era of the camps.
Well, Larry was older by about 6 years, and you know, you mean, Oren, you know this better than anyone. When we attempt to examine the Holocaust period, we have to suspend the normal definitions of terms as we use them in the everyday world that we live in. A word like friendship in the upside down universe of Auschwitz was not something casual. It meant the difference between life and death. If you had someone whom you could tag team with to find scraps of food or to find a way to work indoors in the middle of a freezing winter, it could save your life. And that was the kind of relationship they had. Larry appreciated Siggi's intuitions, his abilities to come up with innovative ways to solve problems, and got him indoors, got him working in what was known by prisoners as the Canada warehouses, Canada being a country that the prisoners in Auschwitz envisioned as a very wealthy, comfortable place to be. The Canada warehouses were the depots where all of the confiscated luggage and belongings from people arriving in Auschwitz were sent for sorting out, and all the jewelry and other precious things found there were packaged up and sent to Gestapo headquarters in Berlin. After the war, they went through the camp together. They went through death marches together. They lost each other when they were separated just shy of liberation, when Siggi went to Mauthausen and Larry was sent off to a subcamp. They were reunited after the war. And my conceit in writing Unstoppable was to use a promise that Siggi had made to his friend Larry, that when Siggi would arrive in New York, he would find Larry's parents and make sure they knew that he was alive, and tell them the story of how they survived together. So the housing, the narrative housing of Unstoppable is Siggi telling Larry's parents the story of their years in Nazi Germany.
One of the things you mentioned how Larry saved my father's life by getting him the job inside Canada, which for sure did. But then later, my father was able to return the favor, and on the death march from Auschwitz to Mauthausen, when Larry couldn't walk or carry himself, my father basically carried him on his shoulders and kept him from being shot on the spot, because when you were on that death march, anyone who lagged behind was shot. Anyone who collapsed was shot. And any excuse to shoot you, you had to keep moving and moving and moving. And if you weren't healthy enough to walk, you certainly were going to be healthy enough to do hard labor once you got there. So they got rid of you on the way. So it was a brutal, horrible thing, and my father saved his life. So with them each having saved each other's lives, you can imagine the love and the bond that they had after the war when they came to America. How often does somebody get to save your life and you get to save their life? It's a pretty rare statistic, I'm sure.
And the friendship continued afterwards as well. They were buddies in selling ties and adult garments out of the trunk of their car. They pulled their money and bought a car and traveled around selling items from the trunk of their car. And then later, after Siggi had his bank, he appointed Larry. Ivan, what was his title? Head of acquisitions or supply? Purchasing, a very trusted position. And it's because Ivan Siggi could trust Larry with anything. They had saved each other's lives. So it's an important story, important part of Siggi's story.
Yeah, I'm wondering, Ivan, what was that like, just kind of growing up, seeing that relationship and other survivors? I mean, that era, I you can tell from reading the book that there were certain survivors who knew each other, might play cards together sometimes. Like, what was that like as a kid in that environment?
Well, I noticed from the onset, and that made my childhood and my siblings very different from the rest of our American friends in the neighborhood, is that they had a special bond amongst themselves. You didn't have to save somebody's life in order to have this special bond. As long as you were in any way, shape, or form had been in a camp, had been on a death march, had relatives murdered, had been beaten, tortured, any of the above, because of Hitler and the Nazis and what they did, there was an immediate camaraderie and love. It was like people lost so much family that when they found anybody from any family that was still alive, it became the new family. And it gave them hope for the future, to carry on, to have children, have grandchildren, have great-grandchildren. And it would have fallen apart if they didn't stick together like that. It was a special love that nobody else could possibly imagine, of people who had been through that. I mean, you can compare it to like war buddies who were in the same platoon and went in the same battles, and forever they're pals for life because they all served and went through the same horrors. It's something like that. It's an elevated bond and friendship that's beyond normal friendship. and probably kept them from becoming depressed, becoming loners, and even suicidal and killing themselves after the war, by feeling that they had no one left to talk to, no one left to about anything, and that's why it was so special. But that was so obvious to me and my brother and my sister. So it was strange. It was different. It was scary. It was a lot of things.
You know, the issue of these friendships and this almost like war platoon bond that you describe, it makes me think of, you know, something that I was thinking when I was reading the biography, the issue of loyalty. You know, the issue of loyalty that Siggi almost demanded from his customers at the bank, and I think it seems to me like there was this interesting kind of trade-off, right? That he would do everything for his family. He would do everything for these people who were his close friends, people that he went through the Shoah with, and he would take good care of his customers, but he wanted loyalty in return, you know. And I'm wondering, how did Ivan, this is a question for Ivan directly, you know, how did you get that sense of that kind of that requirement of loyalty as his son? How did you perceive this thing? I mean, the way Joshua writes about it in the book, it's almost intimidating at times, you know.
No,
that expectation.
There's no question that loyalty meant listening to what he said. Loyalty meant obedience to what he was saying. And yes, if you didn't listen and you didn't obey, you would feel his wrath. He would feel his wrath. He would let you know how he felt about it. And it wasn't a good feeling. It wasn't a good feeling. It was a motivation enough to want to try and make him happy as often as we could, because he didn't want to be on the receiving end of him being of a bad mood, of a Siggi bad mood.
Joshua, when you were interviewing Siggi's colleagues and others in his orbit for the book, what is your perspective on that issue?
Well, you know, this is first of all, this is someone who had seen human nature at its worst, and survived an environment where you couldn't trust anything that the Germans told you. You couldn't trust anything that the Nazis said. You know, they could promise you a warm job, extra food or whatever, and the next thing you knew, they'd be sending you to the gas chamber. The values that we hold sacred were trashed inside the concentration camps. So for someone coming out of that environment, I don't think it's so surprising to find that wanting some real reassurance that if I give myself to you, if I work on your behalf, that I can count on your loyalty to me, because it was the one thing that had been betrayed again and again and again and again. So there's that aspect to it. It was difficult writing about it, quite frankly. You know, I felt an obligation to present Siggi in, I wouldn't say an overly favorable light, but at least in a way that many extraordinary qualities were highlighted. I mean, one of the things that I found was that he embodied many of the same qualities that I would want to have in my own life. You know, creativity and compassion, and you know, a love of education and a sense of humor, and determination and perseverance, and, you know, things that I would want for myself and my family. but certainly he was damaged goods. I think, Ivan, was the way you once described it for me. You know, when it came to emotional things, he had been put through the worst imaginable hells, and things were very difficult for him. He lived with nightmares, you know, every day. I don't know that if someone has not come up in that kind of an environment with a parent who came through the Shoah, that it's possible to understand just how complex the psychology of that family dynamic can become.
I think he certainly, one way he kept the nightmares at bay was through work. Your book, you know, recounts his really remarkable success. It's a fascinating story, and one that I was surprised to be so engaged with, because I don't read a lot of, you know, business biographies, right? And yet this was kind of a special one. I mean, not just because of where Siggi was coming from, but also because of some, you know, some of those qualities that saw through, and that preternatural sense, that kind of fox-like instinct. I mean, I still don't understand how in the world he thought to just start buying up shares of Wilshire Oil, like where that even came from. Where is this, you know, this you know, young European Jew comes up with that, you know? So that's but I was struck by the issue of work, right? Work is another theme that I think runs through his life. I mean, certainly during his time in Auschwitz, as we mentioned before, I mean, the ability to work, it's an irony, you know. We know the phrase Arbeit macht frei. It was terribly cruel irony for most who went through the camps, but yet securing indoor work opportunities, getting the opportunity to work in Canada, you know, that's it didn't ensure survival for countless Holocaust victims, but in some cases, like Siggi's, you know, it really made the difference. But even before that, volunteering out of the blue for special work details, saying he could do this, saying he could do that, saying he was a master. I mean, I expected him to say at one point he's a master chef. It's like, and it seemed like there was nothing that he couldn't claim expertise at. Often brazenly bluffing his way in, and that really often made the difference between life and death. And then later on, he's clearly a workaholic. So I'm just wondering, you know, on this issue of work, you know, what's your perspective on the meaning and value of work in Siggi's experience and philosophy?
Ivan, you want to try that one?
Well, he explains in his testimony to the Shoah Foundation that working harder meant working longer, working faster, because if he didn't, he would be shipped. They had this fear of being shipped to the camps, so he knew that he always had to work harder than the next man with that axe hanging over his head. And so that drive, the ability to work that many hours, whether it's forced labor in an arms factory under Nazi guards, or whether it's doing forced labor in the camps, or working till 3, 4 in the morning and buying or selling a company. He had the strength. He was short, but he was strong like Hercules. He was 5'5". Men that were 6'5" couldn't keep up with him when they walked down the block. They'd be chasing him. They'd be in their dust. He just walked faster, talked faster, and thought faster than most human beings. And those skills enabled him to just keep going. I mean, I don't want to call him the Energizer Rabbit, but he was the Energizer man. He just never stopped. He never quit. He never ran out of energy. He was just a powerhouse. He was described as by Barry Farber as a volcano, and that's a perfect word for him. Explosive and not and unstoppable, like the title of the book.
It's a great image. Joshua, do you want to add anything?
Well, you know, when everything has been taken away from you, whatever you have, however small it may be, is priceless. So if there were even the smallest opportunity for him to find a job, something to do that would save his life, he took it. And if it meant inventing the most outrageous lies about his background, his skills, he had no problem doing that. You know, he heard guards in Auschwitz talking about how they needed bricklayers. So he walked up and said, "I've had years of experience as a master bricklayer." I think later he said something like, "I knew about bricklaying as much as you know about belly dancing." But he would come up with these, you know, brazen stories to stay alive. He heard that they needed a doctor's assistant in the prisoner hospital, so he volunteered for that. He says, "I couldn't even bear to see a chicken get his head cut off, and here they were having me assist in all of these horrible operations and everything." But you do what you have to do, and he did have this uncanny ability to see opportunities where others couldn't. I mean, there's this one story. Do you mind if I tell you this one story? It's one of my
Please.
favorite Siggi stories. It was during the death march from Auschwitz to Mauthausen in January of 45, freezing cold winter, and his shoes were falling off because the shoelaces had deteriorated in the snow and the sleet and the rain. And if he lost his shoes, he would get frostbite and he would die because his, you know, your body's too weak after having been in Auschwitz to fight off any infection. So when the guards bedded the prisoners down for the night, he crept over to a little tree that he saw, and with a spoon, the one thing that he had kept with him from the camp was a spoon. He used the edge of the spoon to score strips of bark off of this sapling. And then he braided the pieces together and invented shoelaces from little bark of tree, and wrapped it around his feet. And sure enough, his shoes held. So that little something saved his life. And he would see the little something, you know, that other people would overlook. When he was hunting Nazis for the U.S. Counterintelligence Corps after the war as a way of thanking his liberators for having saved his life, he and a crew were in Linz, Austria, and they had been in someone's apartment looking for evidence that this guy might have been, you know, in tight with the top Nazis. They didn't find anything, but it was the middle of July. It was a hot day, and Siggi saw in the fireplace of this apartment, this very beautiful apartment, marble fireplace, there was ashes. So he's saying, who makes a fire in the middle of a blazing hot day in July? So he sticks his hand into the ashes, and sure enough, he pulls out photographs of the owner of the apartment hanging out with some Nazi big shots. And he realizes that this is a potential war criminal and was able to hunt him down. He saw those kinds of opportunities. I think it's because the smallest thing when you have nothing becomes priceless. And he had that kind of value for everything in his life.
He clearly had a, yeah, Ivan, go ahead.
To continue with that vision he had of seeing things where other people wouldn't notice them, that came into that was tremendously helpful in his entire success story as a businessman, because anybody on Wall Street, anybody who's bought stock, any stockbroker, anyone who's looks at the annual reports of companies, they realize that the smart ones do anyhow, that it's not what's in the bold print, and that what meets the eyes that's important. A lot of that is just fluff to get the stockholders excited about owning the stock, and how great the future of the company is. But if you're an investment analyst, you don't look at that. You're looking between the lines. You're looking at the fine print. You're not looking at the president's message, which is pretty much just an advertisement, like I told you. You're looking at the footnotes, because it's in the footnotes of those financial statements that the real worth of the company lies, and whether the company is doing well or has problems. And that was one of his, he nicknamed himself Eagle Eye, because he would not miss the smallest iota and detail. And that really was one of the great keys to his success.
I think that all of this is definitely true. It comes out very, very clearly in biography and in you know, if anybody has ever had a chance to watch any of his testimonies or speeches, he also credits the Almighty for his survival. And I wanted to make sure that we talk and that I ask you about the theme of faith and the theme of Jewish identity. You know, there's some, keeping kosher comes up again and again, you know, and the importance of having kosher food available for his customers, right? Or that certain events would be kosher. Even though he says, you know, he says his mother kept kosher, his father not as much, you know, and or Sabbath observance. There are these practical aspects to Jewish identity, but then there's also this aspect that comes up again and again of faith, of the importance of Jewish identity. What is your perspective, each of you, on the role that Judaism and Jewish faith and identity played for him in his survival and after?
Well, he certainly, over and over again, credits the Almighty for having saved his life, given him an opportunity, given him the intelligence to think of the opportunity. But he definitely felt inspired and looked over by a higher, more powerful being than that which exists on earth. And that spiritual bond he had with whoever is, you know, he's looking at above, was seemed to have strengthened his immune system, which has been a proven thing in scientific studies, that whether there is a God or there isn't a God, it remains to be seen. But when you believe in one, it's been proven that it can strengthen your immune system. So in my father's case, he credits his belief in the Almighty for saving his life. And while other people might call it luck, he might call it luck one day himself. But in the same breath, he would also say it was the Almighty that was made him lucky. He would still tie the two together.
There was a qualification, though. Several times in the transcripts of his talks, or in the stories that Siggi's children or friends shared with me researching the text of this book, it was clear that he was very troubled by the children who were killed in the Holocaust. The 1.5 million young people under the age of 12, I believe, is the statistic, who died in the Holocaust, who were murdered. And that troubled him deeply. His closest friend, when it came to these profound issues, and you know, Aaron, you and I share, I think, the experience of teaching theodicy on an undergraduate level. How do you reconcile a God-centered view of creation with evil and the horrors that happened 85 years ago in Europe? He would go to his rabbi, and that was the one place, I think, where he became a real philosopher. He was always wise. He had insights into things. But I think when he was with his rabbi is when he went deep into theological issues. And well, I think one thing he would say if you were here is that don't think that the story of the Holocaust, the importance of understanding the Holocaust, doesn't apply to you if you happen to not be Jewish. If you happen to be, agnostic or atheist or Catholic or Muslim, whatever you may be, this story concerns you as well, because the target now is the Jews. Tomorrow it will be some other group. And I'm jumping around a little bit, but Oren, you may recall the footage from January 6th with the man among the people storming the Capitol building who's wearing that sweatshirt with Camp Auschwitz printed on the sweatshirt. That kind of racism and anti-Semitism are still alive. They're at the heart of the violence and the bitterness and the hatred that we've seen around us for too long now. I think Siggi would have wanted people to understand the history of the Holocaust, regardless of whether they were believers or not, because he understood that this history is critical to our survival moving forward.
I think, that you already gave an answer to the next question I was going to ask, which I wanted to ask what you think Siggi's perspective would be on the resurgence of anti-Semitism today, just increasing racial tensions and everything that seems like the world is going through this upheaval right now. I'm wondering, Joshua, I think you already gave an answer to it. You could certainly add to it, but I'm wondering, Ivan, what do you think your father would say to seeing a resurgence of anti-Semitism in particular in 2021?
Well, it wouldn't surprise him because from the day I was able to understand the meaning of the word, he always thought that anti-Semitism always was and always will be. He was a man of extremes. He thought there will always be wars, and there'll be peace. There'll always be anti-Semitism, maybe less anti-Semitism at other times, but it's not going away. There will always be rich people and there will always be poor people. So for somebody who sees the world in black and white, it would not come as a shock that there will always be anti-Semitism. And I think a lot of that came from, at least at that time, he had reason to believe, because if the church in catechisms in schools were teaching the world and putting on passion plays that the Jews killed Christ, that the Jews murdered the Son of God, if that story wasn't going to change radically, which it hadn't in his lifetime, it only changed in the 70s when the Pope said it was the Romans, not the Jews. But when you have for centuries and centuries and centuries, that being instilled into the generation after generation after generation of Christians, you instill that brainwashing and that evil notion that these are the enemies of our religion, and anything that comes to them, they deserve. They should be exterminated or killed or tortured or whatever. It's a sad thing, but it all boils down to education. Fortunately, things have evolved in that regard, and Jews and Christians get along like brothers, like one family, which nobody would ever think could occur. Now there's bigger problems with Muslims, but Jews and Christians, it's sort of like almost proved my father wrong. They're doing the best to eliminate anti-Semitism and get along well.
Well, welcome back, everyone. I am struck again by the power of the conversation we had last May, Ivan. And, as I was preparing my notes for this conversation, I was thinking that I really wanted to talk about anti-Semitism and the resurgence of anti-Semitism. And then right there it was in the recording. It's so prescient, and sadly, nothing seems to have changed in the last, 8 months or so. And so I guess that, what I wanted to ask you is that what is your perspective, and what do you think your father's perspective would be about the current situation with anti-Semitism in this country? And you should unmute. Do you think anything has changed in the last few months?
Well, no, I don't know about months. I'm just saying in the last few years, there's been an increase of anti-Semitism, not just in the US, but everywhere in the world. The rest of the world, the non-Jewish world, looks for excuses to hate Jews and use them as scapegoats again. Whether it's in Israel, how the Palestinians are being treated, or which is the newest excuse to hate all Jews. It's again because it's misinformation and a lack of education. They don't realize that the true nature of the story, because they're taught a warped version by governments, by the Arab governments. So they're not very fair. And so there's and the domestic anti-Semitism and the kidnapping or bombing or desecrating synagogues in America. It's from anti-Semites who didn't feel the courage or the ability to be anti-Semitic and act out on their hatred. In other words, it was repressed, or it was like kept within because it wasn't politically correct to hate Jews again, or to attack Jews again, etc. But they've been given too much publicity in the media. Not enough people have been attacking them for their ideologies. And when you don't fight back, the worst case scenario is that it's going to increase, not decrease. So all Jews and non-Jews must be vigilant, and taking steps, whatever steps it takes, to fight anti-Semitism and nipping it in the bud, because a little spark becomes a fire, and a fire becomes out of control, and then sometimes there's little you can do about it. As the Holocaust.
It seems like, in my sense is the last few months during COVID, especially, that sense of just having free reign to express one's, deepest, darkest hatred seems to have just continued unabated. I think that's something that strikes me so strongly. I would be remiss, if we're talking about anti-Semitism, not to mention that you got Deborah Lipstadt to write the foreword to the biography, and I'm just wondering, how did that come about?
She was contacted through one of the I believe through one of the charitable organizations that my sister's involved in. It's called Blue Card. It helps Holocaust survivors that are indigent get their needs taken care of. And my sister established the Siggi Wilzig Fund at the Blue Card to fight cancer, because of the horror of somebody who'd been through the concentration camps and now late in life gets cancer. And sometimes, in my father's case, the chemo made him think he was back in the concentration camps. So it's a terrible situation for somebody who has to first suffer from the Holocaust, and then later in their life suffer from cancer, and maybe not have the financial needs to take care of themselves. So I think it was through the Blue Card organization that someone got a hold of Deborah Lipstadt for us.
Well, it's certainly a very powerful forward. I'm going to put in the chat, since you mentioned it, the information about Blue Card, which is a remarkable organization. And I think today on January 27th, International Holocaust Remembrance Day, and when there are fewer and fewer survivors with us every year, I think it's worth mentioning and putting up there. Anti-Semitism today. I'm going to quote Deborah Lipstadt's forward from the book. She's talking about your father, and she said, and I quote, "He carried with him an enduring concern that the anti-Semitism at the root of the Holocaust was back with a vengeance. He was enraged, as every decent person should be, at the offenses of Holocaust deniers. He worried that due to their propaganda, people would forget the past and fall prey to the hatred that was its foundation stone. Sadly, today we see that Siggi's fears were not unfounded." I'm not asking you to comment specifically on that, but I'm wondering if you have a comment in response to Neil Reisner's question posted in the chat. Should we be afraid? Should we consider leaving? Did your father ever consider leaving? Going to Israel, let's say, or somewhere else? Is there anywhere else?
No, things were never on the verge of, in his mind, when he was in the United States, of fleeing. Of course, when he was in Nazi Germany, he couldn't flee. His family didn't have the income or the connections or the affidavits in order to get out of the country, which is why so many of them were murdered. But in America, while he warned against anti-Semitism and its dangers, he didn't believe that a Holocaust could ever take place again in the United States. Completely different scenario. And that's why he didn't think it could happen. In Germany, you have German Christians and Jews, basically. In America, you have Blacks, Puerto Ricans, Asians, Spanish. It's a melting pot of nationalities. So it wouldn't be as simple to just get one group to attack the other, end of story, like it was in Germany with the Nazis. So he didn't think it could happen here. And I think he had faith in the American people that they would never fall for that again, or want to be involved in any way with that kind of hatred. And I think he had confidence in the Constitution and the democracy that we lived in, that it would not ever lose sight of equal justice for all ethnic groups.
Let's hope and pray that that is the case. So I wanted to ask, how has the book been doing since publication? What is your sense? Are people reading and hearing your father's story? Is it making an impact?
Oh, the comments that I get on a regular basis from people who've read it are all unanimous. Greatest story I ever heard of, best book I ever read, a legacy to your father, an example of pride for the whole Jewish people, a book that can heal the world and prevent atrocities from occurring, something that can give them hope and inspiration and save lives and like no other book can. And it's doing quite well. And the one thing that almost all of them say is, when's there going to be a movie? When are we going to see the movie? It's a perfect.
Who's going to play your father? And who's going to play your father? Who's going to play you?
I'll leave that to the casting directors and the professionals in Hollywood. But there's no question that that's the direction we're taking, because the book is so important for so many reasons that it has to have the global impact that a book such as The Diary of Anne Frank had on the world. We have deals in several different countries. We need deals in every country so they can be translated into languages for everyone to learn this story. And obviously, just like The Diary of Anne Frank was turned into a movie and a play and this and that, every vehicle in media that can be used to reach the masses and will be used. just this morning, we launched the reader's guide for high schools and junior high schools to be teaching it all over in schools all over the state of New Jersey through the Jewish Federation and Sharon Horowitz's hard work. The book will be taught, I'm sure, in many different schools. And so just like the book needs to be spread from country to country in different language, it needs to be taught in schools and adopted by different boards of education in every junior high school and high school in America. It's not just so the world reads about my father's book. Holocaust education and genocide, not just Jewish genocide, should be taught in every high school in America, mandatory, because it's that important.
Well, I can't agree more. So, Ivan, I wanted to ask you about your father's legacy, particularly in your life. In what way, and looking at the time, this might end up being the last question, but in what way do you live your life in honoring the memory and the legacy of your father? What do you do that has you get up every morning thinking about what he left for you to accomplish?
I'm doing it now. I do it all
Good
the
answer.
time. I do it all the time. It's speak, educate, teach, explain, and entertain the world with a great story, because I'm an entertainer at heart, and I'm very passionate about anything I do, but not more passionate about anything than his story and how it could help the world.
Well, if you don't have anything you want to ask me, which you probably don't, and if no one else out there has any questions for Sir Ivan Wilzig, and the legacy of his father, Siggi Wilzig. The book is Unstoppable. I highly recommend it. Available where all books are sold. But more importantly, I think today on January 27th, it's just absolutely critical that we not only remember the stories of the survivors who are no longer with us, who are still with us, tell them, teach them, educate with them, but also that we understand that their legacy lives on through us and that we need to do our part in order to really make the world a better place. I do want to remind our viewers that Holocaust and Genocide Awareness Week continues tomorrow with 2 final events at noon tomorrow. We have we have the second to last event, which is sorry, I'm blanking out. It's our event on anti-Semitism. I'm just going to bring up the information really quick. So the event is co-organized by the Green School and the AJC, the American Jewish Community. It's called The New Anti-Semitism in Europe, Latin America, and the US. And you can find the information on the link that I'm going to post in the chat right now before we conclude. All of the information on our upcoming, oh, terrific, thanks, Naomi, for posting that. So the New Anti-Semitism in Europe, Latin America, and the US is at noon tomorrow, followed by our final event of Holocaust and Genocide Awareness Week 2022, the Shabbat of the Living at 5 p.m. Both events are on Zoom. We look forward to seeing you there. Thank you again to Ivan. Brian, I don't know if you have any final words.
No, just on behalf of the FIU College of Communication, Architecture, and the Arts, CARTA, thank you, Mr. Wilzig. Thank you, Dr. Stier. An amazing conversation that brings up so many emotions. Again, I would echo Dr. Stier's recommendation that you, if you haven't read the book, get the book. If give it as a gift, talk about it, read it. It's really impressive. Katie Martin on the back of the book from ABC News, if you don't mind, has an amazing quote about the book. She said, just when we most need it. And I think you could say that every single day. I don't think there is a day that we don't need it, but Unstoppable arrives to remind us of the resilient human spirit and its capacity to overcome the most daunting foes. A remarkable narrative from a chapter of human history that never stops grabbing us by the throat, a timely and gripping tale for us all. So again, I would encourage everyone to read this, and thank you again for letting us be part of it.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.